Hello, everybody. We are back with another GPS Live. Jonathan's back this week.
I am indeed.
He's back, and we had a great week last week talking about the Grit Report and the awesome research that the GuidePoint Research and Intelligence team has been doing in ransomware and talking about some ransomware stories. So this week, miraculously, we have a fully ransomware-free week of stories.
You say that.
We say that.
But there's still ransomware happening.
There's still ransomware happening. It's just that none of it is the stories that we're talking about. So we actually we found some really great stories this week to bring to you guys and go through. But before we get started, let's get some formalities out of the way. First of all, Jonathan, how are you? How was your last week?
I'm well. I was out at a conference last Friday over here in Tampa. It was kind of nice to get out and see some of our vendor partners that we work very closely with, some of our customers. Get a little knowledge dropped, grab some swag as always.
Swag's great.
So quite lovely, but glad to be back.
Awesome.
How are
Excellent.
you?
Well, that is good to hear. I'm doing really well. Had a great week myself. Prepping for next week, which is going to be our company kickoff.
Yes.
Which means that next week we will not have a show. But if you are joining us live right now, thank you so much for giving us your time. Go ahead and leave a comment. Let us know where you're from. Please interact with us on the stories. We love involving you guys in the conversation. And if you're watching on demand, thank you so much for, again, giving us that time. And we would love to hear your feedback as these stories have evolved since we've talked about them. Let us know if you've seen anything new about them or things that you might want us to cover for the next week. But before we jump in, anything that we say on this show is just Jonathan and my opinion. We are not the official representatives of GuidePoint Security as far as like the opinions or beliefs that the company may hold. This is just the both of us having fun and talking about cybersecurity.
I'm going to interrupt you there, though, and say that today's show is not brought to you by either of us, but AI.
Yeah, that's true. We played around a little bit this week with using some AI tools to help narrow in our search for stories, and that definitely pointed us in the right direction on a few of these. We've got Martha coming in from Tampa, so that's cool. Love to see that. So let's jump in with our first story, which is about the return of a malware botnet called FritzFrog. Now, Jonathan, do you know anything about this one? Were you familiar with FritzFrog before?
No, I wasn't. I can imagine our Grit team's probably very familiar with these folks. But having read the article, I see that they're taking a bit of an approach of what people forgot, right?
Right, exactly. So to fill anyone in who might not know, FritzFrog is a fileless peer-to-peer botnet that was targeting SSH servers a while back. I think January 2020 might have been like some of the first documented observance of this group. And back then, they had targeted, 500 servers, and they were a pretty big problem because of their decentralized infrastructure and that peer-to-peer nature of their network, right? They didn't have to phone home to a single node. They could talk to any other node within the botnet to receive their instructions. So that made them, pretty malicious and pretty hard to track down. But now they are back, and they've brought with them our old friend Log4Shell. They are resurrecting the Log4Shell vulnerability from the dead. To utilize with the new facelifted malware that they are pushing out there. The interesting thing about what they're doing with this, and this is something, Jonathan, I think you'll have some great thoughts about, is the fact that Log4Shell, we could all agree, should probably be dead and gone by now. But the problem is that most people saw something like Log4Shell, and they probably patched the most critical pieces of their infrastructure and their organization first, which would be any web-facing applications that leverage Log4Shell or that Log4Shell could take advantage of. And then they left their internal pieces behind, and sometimes those get forgotten. And so what FritzFrog has done is created their new package of malware. They will infect a machine and then use Log4Shell to move and propagate across the internal network, as opposed to trying to jump island hop from organization to organization.
Yeah. No, Tristan, what you mentioned there was a couple of things that really make it challenging to chase after this kind of thing. First off, that peer-to-peer network. Think torrents, where instead of talking to one centralized hub, there may be something announcing where the locations are, but essentially they're talking to each other. This kind of inter-malware communication. So historically, organizations would go and just say, well, hey, where's that command and control server? And shut that down. So now suddenly the individual bits no longer had anybody to talk to, but they can now, at least in this case, talk to each other. So that creates one massive challenge. And the second one, you hit the nail on the head, the fact that when we're taking a more modern risk approach to our vulnerability these days, you may have thousands on your plate. How do you decide which one to target first? And doing something like, well, public facing, right? DMZ, mission critical systems, all kinds of things like that are that can be taken down, that can affect the business, that can be easily targeted from an external perspective. Patch them, cool. But what about all those internal systems? What about maybe those lab boxes that are still on the network? They didn't just have maybe a high risk profile for exposure, but still considerably high risk profile for vulnerability. And that's
Right.
exactly what's happening here is once you find your way in, these boxes can be used to really escalate privileges, pivot around to additional servers and systems, and really turn maybe what was like an isolated compromise into a massive enterprise-wide compromise.
Exactly. Now they've FritzFrog's evolved over time since their first appearances in 2020 to be going after, they've started going after healthcare, they've been going after education targets, government sector targets, but as a fileless malware botnet, right? They are able to fly under the radar pretty well in a lot of cases, because while you might be looking for new files to drop to disk or new things to be happening on that machine, they're operating entirely without dropping those files. They are also leveraging now in their new malware the use of the PwnKit flaw, which I believe is, I don't have to say I believe, I'm looking at it right here on my screen, CVE 2021-4034. And they're using that to achieve local privilege escalation once they're on these machines. So once they gain a foothold, then log4shell across the network, then PwnKit to gain privilege escalation. And they're able to do all of this without dropping these files by using a shared memory location in /dev/shm, which is used by a lot of other Linux-based malware.
That is my classic folder to for all of our Linux fans out there. dev/shm, man, that is a 777 world writable folder for everybody to do your nefarious things in. And of course, that's exactly where they were doing. I think it's more reliable than the temp directory these days when it comes to that stuff. But yeah, you mentioned it between SSH brute forcing capabilities. So, still figuring out how to automate your way in once you have terminal session, escalating privileges, using shared memory locations. These are very sophisticated tactics to avoid any kind of file-based detections. A lot of modern antivirus, what they do is they detect when a file is either written to or modified or added to a system, and then simply say, okay, let's go scan it real quickly. It's new here. But if files are never really dropped, then that avoidance, that kind of detection bypass is really taking a foothold in this case.
Yeah. So this is just a great reminder, right? Vulnerabilities are, they don't go away, right? Just because it's 10 years old doesn't mean it's safe to install that piece of software now. It doesn't, it doesn't mean it's safe to use that piece of hardware. These things are always going to crop back up, and it's so critically important to when these large kind of far-reaching vulnerabilities do pop up. Yes, obviously take care of the most critical pieces of your organization first, the things that are most likely to lead to like full-blown exploitation across your environment. But once you've got those taken care of, you can't take your eye off the ball. You have to continue that effort and push all the way through to make sure that every last instance of this is wiped out, because even a single node can leave you vulnerable, right? especially if like if you go across your entire organization and clear out everything for the log4shell vulnerability, but you've left one or two machines, right, and you're not sure about whether you've gotten or not, and you're kind of just like, yep, 99.999% is close enough, right? It's close enough to 100%. Those machines could just be the ones that are attached to another critical resource. And then someone jumps on there with privilege escalation and they don't need log4shell anymore, right?
No.
They'll spread another way.
It's right. You're sticking to your external pen tests, right? Which is going to do all the things that are external facing. But this is, just another shining example of why internal pen tests and actually focusing on resolving, like you said, all of your vulnerabilities that can be targeted, whether it's an internal machine or an external machine. What's old is new. And I feel like should that be our pattern for this week?
What's old is new. Yeah. For any of our viewers, by the way, if you have experience with log4shell or, this has cropped up in your life before, we would love to hear about it. Go ahead and leave us a comment. We would love to read those stories, and be able to talk about those. If not on this episode, then on the next episode. But what's old is new again, right? What is dead may never die. Was that Game of Thrones? I think that was Game of Thrones.
Oh no! Okay, no more pre-show notes.
Yeah, I think that was Game of Thrones. But coming up on our next story, though, this one is actually really, really critical. Yes. I think because how many people watching or how many organizations out there are leveraging containers to do critical work in their environment? How many home networks and home computers are running containers to do critical things for their home network? So this story, our last story, by the way, came to us from Hacker News. This one is coming to us from Security Week and Hacker News in conjunction. But this story is really interesting. So there is a vulnerability that has been discovered in the runc command prompt, I believe, in Docker, that allows malicious actors to actually access the host file system. Now, this one, Jonathan, is definitely way more in your wheelhouse. So go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, and so the concept of breakouts has been something that has been a bit of a cat and mouse for a long time. We used to have virtual machine breakouts where hypervisors would be targeted by some kind of virtualized environment. Now in this containerized world, it's kind of in a similar fashion where you're going from within an isolated container back to the host system or potentially other containers on the system. And so this particular vulnerability, although fully disclosed and you need to start patching today, if not already, they haven't found any evidence that it's being used in the wild. But check this out. Through this vulnerability, you're able to essentially access the host file system and potentially overwrite either directories or even files themselves. And so the trick here is if you can write files to a host and something can execute that file, maybe like a cron job. So maybe you're overwriting some kind of critical system file. Now that is your backdoor in. And so we're going from some kind of what's supposed to be a secure little box out to the big system that has all those secure little boxes. This is a very big deal because, like you said, we're moving to a very containerized function. I run containers personally at home through a lot of different services and systems to do home automation, to do ad blocking, all kinds of things like that with Pi-hole. And so I will be updating my Docker server immediately. And I hope all of you out there watching will be updating your Docker servers too.
Yeah. And that's the, that is something that you just said there, right there at the end, right? Like these were supposed to be secure, isolated little pods that we could leverage, right? Virtual machines were too heavy and too taxing for a lot of places. You only needed to do one small task. Hey, let's create this tiny, secure, little bundled off place where this task can be completed regularly and we don't have to worry about it. It's not something that's actually touching our host, which is, one of the things that actually makes it, not only super well loved by developers and multiple different, teams within any organization, but also like home users like Jonathan and myself, right? If you're doing any kind of home automation, right? Instead of running 17,000 Raspberry Pis to accomplish all of your different little tasks, right? You can just set up a bunch of little Docker containers. And run those images there. But the presence of a flaw like this that allows access to those subsystems, right? Once again, and I believe you mentioned earlier, I can't remember if it was in the show, or if it was just in the pre-show, but you were talking about like where the actual malicious instances were coming from.
Yeah, and so that's kind of the tough part here, is that we've ran stories in the past about malicious libraries being pushed to things like Ruby gems and pip, but in this case, imagine a malicious container push to Docker Hub, where you're going to just do something as as innocent as get the latest Apache Docker container, but it's coming from a nefarious source. And that nefarious source has a malicious container that is directly using these vulnerabilities to break out, attack the host system, and then take over that host system. And so, one of the big things here is make sure that you're getting your containers from an appropriate source. Make sure that it's the authorized container for that application and developer. Make sure that it is well vetted. That doesn't mean that it still can't be poisoned. We've seen those kinds of things on GitHub. We've seen that kind of stuff again through Ruby gems and other different types of sourceable libraries. But you have to do your due diligence to make sure that whatever you're running on your system here, your host, it's got a lot of privileges. Make sure it's what you want it to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So the vulnerabilities and impacts of this, right, depending on where you're running your containers, what kind of other information is available on that system, if that's customer information or the ability for them to jump into other repositories, or like we just saw with the FritzFrog, right, to drop into that host system and then conduct further follow-on and spread across your environment. And once they're on that host system too and have access to everything, right, there's nothing to stop them from spinning up all of their own little malicious Dockers and containers.
And mining crypto.
Yeah, crypto mining all the way is what I'm thinking here. I think actually going back to the FritzFrog story, I think that was one of the things that they've started doing. Is crypto mining or oh no, you know what? I'm not thinking of FritzFrog. I'm thinking of one of our other stories that we're about to be talking about as we transition over to it. Unless you've got any final thoughts on the run C flaw, Jonathan, just because this one's much more like I know how to use Docker and I have used it, but this is definitely much more in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, just one of the biggest things that you want to keep an eye out for is because containerization is so prevalent in both the home user space and the enterprise space these days, keeping your platform up to date is just as important as running the latest containerized versions themselves. Just because you have a container running Apache and it's the latest and it's patched doesn't mean you're fully secure. The host running a series of applications to support those containers equally needs to be patched. This is the same concept that we saw when you're dealing with different types of hypervisors too in the VM space. The breakouts can exist, and it has nothing to do necessarily with what is going on from an application level within the container. It has to do with what's going on at application level outside of the container. And fun fact also, for a lot of those developers at home, Docker Desktop is also part of this that's being affected, and that update was rolled out yesterday. So this is still very fresh, very new, and my systems are mostly updated. I have one more Docker environment that I need to get done, but taking it very seriously. Because I don't need to become a statistic.
Yep, none of us do. None of us definitely want to. But speaking of becoming a statistic, there's a good chance if you have a small office or home office rather, that you might have been part of a statistic of the next story that we are going to be talking about. This one is actually this had evolution over the course of the week was the very interesting thing. So coming to us from Dark Reading on January 30th, we had the first post about this. And then on February 1st, we had the update post. So coming to us from Dark Reading, on January 30th, the report was that the U.S. federal government is reportedly trying to disrupt the Volt Typhoon attack infrastructure. So Volt Typhoon, well-known APT.
We talked about them on the show.
We have talked about them on the show before. So the FBI and other organizations and private U.S. stakeholders started working together to try and take down this Volt Typhoon botnet, known as the KV-botnet malware, that was impacting small office and home office routers. Now, these routers were, for the most part, end of life. So they were no longer getting security updates or patches from their manufacturers. So this isn't something that was like a major flaw within present across an entire company's portfolio of hardware, as much as it was just these were old old pieces of technology that are going to gradually become vulnerable to things over time anyway, as new technologies come out that we are accounting for like new vectors of attack. So Reuters apparently was talking about this on January 30th. According to multiple unnamed sources, they said, hey, the Department of Justice and the FBI are working to take this down. Lo and behold, a couple days later, feds confirmed the remote killing of Volt Typhoon Soho botnet. So mark one up for the good guys. Good win for us. We love this.
Yeah, and there's something interesting going on there, and I wanted to kind of pick that apart. And I was really trying to get an understanding of what happened exactly. And so first off, one lesson learned: end of life, unpatched, all these things. Like why?
End of life equals end of use. Get rid of it.
There's multi phases, right? There's end of updates, end of life, end of support. All these other things, and then there's Windows, where we told you is end of life, but if you pay us, we'll still support you with updates. But yeah, in this case, these kind of, we'll consider them legacy, I guess, technically, because they are no longer supported and updated, but taking advantage of some known vulnerabilities. Now, I did want to highlight now, through the court authorized operation to delete the KV-botnet malware from the routers, what they did is, I thought, assumption here, hey, let's hack into the routers the same way the bad people did. But no, sadly, this wasn't like a government sanctioned hacking. What they did is they were able to take over the command and control center. Now, earlier in our newscast, we talked about how a particular botnet was peer-to-peer based, where they talk to each other like a spider web.
Right.
But in this case, it's very much more of a hub and spoke model. And so by simply being able to take over that hub on all of the spokes that were actively in communication with that hub, they sent out a delete yourself, essentially, code. And so that kind of cleared up a little bit of my conspiracy around how this was pulled off. But if you, the viewer, have an opinion on whether hacking back or hacking into the system for good is something that we should consider, we'd love to hear your thoughts, feedbacks, and comments on that down below. We do read all comments, whether they're live or in the future. Just want to make sure that's known.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing that you were talking about before the show, was like, how exactly did they do this? And it's brought up in the Dark Reading article as well, right? Like the concept of the federal government just silently reaching into your hardware to take care of a problem, right? And I believe we've actually talked about this specifically on the show before as well, the idea of that happening. But yeah, like you said, in this one, they simply mimicked the command and control infrastructure and were able to send out that remote kill switch. The interesting thing about this, though, is that these are old pieces of hardware, right? They still cannot be patched. So they were able to send out the kill switch and get all of these routers to remove themselves from the botnet. But if that router power cycles, it is vulnerable again to reinfection, because the mitigation will fix.
The hole is still there that got them in this place in the first place.
Yeah, this is rampant and wild speculation on my part, right? The views and opinions expressed by Jonathan and myself are the opinions of Guy Security. But what that leads me to believe is that this mitigation that they placed on here is not actually like fixing the router or patching the router in any way, obviously. And it may not even be removing the botnet entirely. It may not even be removing that malware from the router. Instead, it may just, my thought is, it may just be fixing that malware to say, like, stop communicating with this. So the malware still exists, but also because the malware is there, if the botnet reaches back out, it sees the malware and says, like, oh, hey, it's already here. We don't need to.
You're now inert and benign, although you still may somewhat exists somewhere, right?
It sounds to me like somewhat like a like kind of almost like a vaccination for the routers, right? Like it's saying like, hey, you've got the bad thing already, but we're going to suppress it and make sure that if it comes back around, it says, oh, the bad thing's already here.
Now
That's what it looks like to me.
You said, though, because the actual vulnerability that allowed the hardware to be compromised in the first place still exists because of the fact that there is no patch, automated bots that are compromising systems, I don't imagine this taking very long before potentially it is back part of a botnet. Or even the opportunity of a copycat to say like, well, their botnet got kicked out, but I'm going to put my botnet in here.
Exactly.
And so it's...
And this is really important because what this Volt Typhoon group was apparently using this for was while they were attacking small and home office routers, right, and leveraging that, they were using it as a distributed network to try and go after industrial and critical infrastructure. And it was very hard to track down because it was so distributed, right? So imagine you are a state actor, like this case, where you have this massive distributed network of bots that you can leverage to try and take down some critical infrastructure. It's very hard to track down where exactly that's coming from. And to stop it, because at that point, if you've got attacks coming from all sides, the only thing to do is just kind of say, well, we'll just take it all offline until we can figure it out, which when it comes to critical infrastructure is kind of a hard decision to make. In fact, we've seen that decision made before when it came to the Colonial Pipeline attack, right? They were unable to mitigate it in the moment, and so they just took the entire pipeline down in order to stop the loss of profit that they were seeing, because it was impossible to go after that attack. So I'm
really excited that we have a couple minutes left.
Yeah, we have a couple minutes left to cover this final story that we're gonna go through. You're so excited about this one. I'm gonna go ahead and let you.
Oh my goodness. Well, home office, home router is one thing, but let's go straight to everybody's hearts with generative AI being abused to tackle some of pop culture's largest stars, including people like Taylor Swift. You may have seen it in the news lately that Taylor Swift and amongst other famous folks are being I guess we'll say targeted or potentially abused in the generative AI space, mostly in image generation. So much so that major businesses, including Microsoft and X, formerly known as Twitter, are being bombarded with requests to create potentially malicious, lewd, and abusive images of these famous folks. And they're now simply killing the search. You can no longer type these things in the search bar or make these requests. That's my highlight. I'm just going to throw it back to you. I'm just happy we got to this because
we're finally to this point.
It shows where we're going.
It took beloved cultural icon Taylor Swift being the victim of one of these, right? I mean, this stuff has been going on. Deepfakes has been a problem for forever, absolutely, right? I remember almost a decade, I feel like, ago, like the earliest deepfake stuff happening. And that's always been an issue, but this has spurred not only tech companies to action, but also government officials. So the senators have gotten together and introduced the Disrupt Explicit Forged Images and Non-Consensual Edits Defiance Act, and this is designed to basically say, hey, if you are responsible at all for the proliferation of non-consensual explicit imagery and deepfakes and videos, you can be held responsible for that. So that would not only hold the individuals who generated those things responsible, but also the AI systems themselves and the companies that made them, and then the companies that allowed that to proliferate. So that's why you saw things like X immediately coming in and saying you just can't search for Taylor Swift anymore. And this is great. It is disheartening that it took this kind of thing, right? It took something like this to spur action. And it will be interesting to see how if this act is passed. I would love to see the actual text of the bill. But if it's interesting to see, it will be interesting to see if this act is passed, how it is applied, right? Will it only be if you have enough clout to kind of get out there and say like, hey, these are damaging to my reputation? Or would someone like Jonathan or myself really, you know, in the large scheme of things, nobody's, if something were to happen?
I think it's going to be down to whether you have a check box, a blue check or not. And so I'd like to apply for a blue check as soon as possible. I consider this show to make me famous.
Yes, absolutely. We are the most famous people.
That we know.
Absolutely within the space. Definitely on the 10:30 to 11 / 1:30 to 2 time slot of LinkedIn Live cybersecurity shows. That's definitely us. But that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you so much for watching. We had a few people. We have Martha. We've got Adora. I don't have time to go through all of the comments right now, actually, and look at them. But, you know, thank you guys so much for joining us and giving us your time on a Friday. If you've been watching on demand, again, thank you for the time. Go ahead and let us know where you're coming from and any thoughts that you had on the stories we covered this week. But until not next week, but the week after it, I have been and will continue to be Tristan Morris.
And I am Jonathan Singer.
And we will see you all next time.